Tokyo awoke under a heavy, humid sky, the kind that usually signaled another day of relentless planning and grim reports from the front. Inside the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese High Command, officers moved with their usual hardened discipline until a young communications officer rushed in with a message that shattered the morning routine. A sudden, blinding explosion had been reported over Hiroshima. Communications from the city had gone dark instantly. No radio chatter, no military signals, no civil distress calls, just silence. At first, the senior officers dismissed it as an exaggeration. Perhaps an ammunition depot had detonated. Perhaps an air raid had struck a vital district. But the scale of the silence felt wrong. More fragmented reports followed, each more alarming than the last. A flash brighter than the sun, a towering column of smoke, a shockwave felt miles beyond the city limits. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. Nothing in their experience. No conventional bomb. No known weapon could wipe out all communications in a heartbeat. The room, once buzzing with command activity, grew still. A reconnaissance mission was ordered immediately. Until those pilots returned, the High Command was left with an unfamiliar and unsettling feeling. Uncertainty. It was the first moment the war felt different, no longer a struggle between armies, but a confrontation with something beyond imagination. The reconnaissance order was relayed with unusual urgency, cutting through the typical layers of protocol that governed military communication. Within minutes, a scout plane prepared for takeoff from an airfield south of Tokyo. The pilot, Lieutenant General Masuda's most experienced aerial observer, was told only one thing: Hiroshima is silent. Find out why. He questioned nothing. Silence from a major military city was already alarming enough. Hiroshima was not merely an urban center. It was a significant supply and communication hub. Entire divisions depended on its systems. Losing contact for even a few minutes meant trouble. Losing contact entirely meant something catastrophic had happened, something beyond the ordinary nightmares of war. The aircraft ascended into a pale sky streaked with thin clouds. Below, Japan sprawled out in patterns of farmland and wounded industrial zones. From above, the scars of war were softer roads broken, but still visible. Factories bombed, but still standing in twisted silhouettes. The pilot had seen battle damage countless times. He knew what ruin looked like. That familiarity made what he was about to witness impossible to understand. As he neared Hiroshima's coordinates, he noted something odd. Normally, by this point, the city's outline bridges, dense blocks of buildings, the curving river would be visible from kilometers away. But now, from the same distance, he saw only a vague haze. It wasn't fog. It wasn't smoke from a typical bombing. It was something thicker, a shimmering distortion rising from the ground like heat over desert sand. He descended slightly, adjusting his goggles. His hands, steady in countless missions, tightened around the controls. There should have been movement trains, cars, soldiers, civilians, something. But the landscape ahead was void of motion. No glints of metal, no systematic patterns of traffic, just a stillness that felt unnatural. Then through the haze, the full shape revealed itself. Not a city, but a wound carved into the earth. Hiroshima was gone. Not bombed in the sense the pilot understood. Not damaged, not burned block by block, not shattered by conventional means. It had been erased, flattened, pulverized. What had once been a city of nearly 350,000 people was now a vast circular expanse of gray and black, like the scorched surface of an alien world. The pilot froze. His breath caught. His training told him to analyze, but his mind refused to categorize what his eyes saw. For a moment, he simply flew in silence, letting the aircraft drift as if he had forgotten he was the one steering it. He dropped altitude for a clearer view. The devastation became even more incomprehensible. The roads had disappeared. The buildings whose rooftops once created a recognizable grid were gone, without trace. Landmarks he had memorized, the central parade ground, the military headquarters, storage depots, even the castle, were nowhere to be found. Everything had been crushed, vaporized, or scattered like ashes in the wind. He scanned for survivors. Normally, after a bombing, streets would be filled with chaos figures running, emergency crews forming human chains, fire brigades pushing through debris. Here, there was nothing. Not a single visible person. Not a single shadow moving between ruins. Only fires burning without direction, licking at fragments too small to identify. He radioed the high command. "Tokyo headquarters. This is reconnaissance unit. I am over Hiroshima." He paused, unable to continue. His voice broke. "There is no Hiroshima." Static whispered back to him before the incredulous reply. "Repeat. Clarify damage level." He swallowed hard. "All structures destroyed. The entire city's center gone. Everything flattened. I cannot locate streets, districts, or any organized remains." His voice trembled despite his effort to remain professional. "This does not resemble conventional bombing." On the other end of the line, the command center fell silent. The operator, trained for clarity and discipline, faltered as he relayed the message to the officers behind him. The pilot made another pass, circling lower despite the searing updrafts rising from the burning earth. Even through the aircraft's vibrations, he could feel the heat unnatural, blistering, as though the ground itself had been turned into a furnace. The destruction wasn't uniform. At the epicenter, nothing recognizable remained. Outward from that point, some shadows of structures' metal frames twisted like strands of wire rose weakly, only to collapse with the faintest tremor. He noticed strange patterns scorched into the ground, elongated black shapes that resembled silhouettes. For a moment, he wondered if these were objects. Then the realization struck him, sickening and cold. They were shadows of people, imprinted permanently onto the stone where they had stood at the instant of the blast. The headset crackled again. "Reconnaissance unit, report any signs of enemy aircraft or explosives." "No enemy aircraft," the pilot replied, forcing a steadier tone. "No anti-aircraft activity. No craters indicating multiple bombs. Just one point of origin. A single massive explosion. Unlike anything I have ever seen. Unlike anything anyone has ever seen." He wished desperately in that moment for an explanation he could give the officers awaiting his report. But he had none. There were no patterns of destruction that matched known weapons. No scatter pattern from incendiaries. No fragmentation debris from conventional explosives. It was as if the city had been struck by a force of nature, something closer to a volcanic eruption or an earthquake than an air attack. Yet the precision was undeniable. The city, not the surrounding mountains, was the target. He pulled higher, gaining altitude for one final sweep. The enormity of the void below him stretched far beyond the blast radius he had initially estimated. Smoke rose in immense, spiraling columns, merging with the lingering haze like ghostly fingers reaching into the sky. Rivers glimmered faintly but were clogged with wreckage, their banks scorched and distorted. Bridges were either obliterated or melted into warped piles of metal. He searched instinctively for hope for survivors, for movement, for anything human, but saw none. The silence of the city reached him even from the cockpit. It was a silence more terrifying than the roar of battle, because it implied not struggle, but complete, instant annihilation. Before turning back toward Tokyo, he made a final transmission. "Headquarters, this is not a battlefield. This is something else. Whatever destroyed Hiroshima, it is beyond our understanding. I repeat, It is beyond anything in our military experience. The return flight felt longer, heavier. He replayed the images in his mind, searching for logic where none existed. How could one weapon destroy a city with the power of 1,000 firestorms? How could it vaporize buildings, erase streets, leave human shadows burned into stone? By the time he landed, his face was pale and his hands still trembling. Officers rushed to gather his report, expecting diagrams and impact assessments. But the pilot, normally stoic, stumbled through his account with an expression of someone who had witnessed the impossible. In Tokyo, his words rippled through the high command like an electric shock. The initial disbelief gave way to dread. In war, certainty was a pillar. Now that pillar had crumbled. The commanders realized with mounting horror that they were no longer dealing with familiar rules of conflict. They were dealing with a weapon capable of rewriting the nature of war itself, and if the Americans had used it once, they could use it again. Hiroshima was not just gone. It was a warning written in fire. The briefing room in Tokyo had weathered years of war-endless maps, shifting front lines, nightly updates, arguments, and orders carved in urgency. But on the afternoon of August 6, 1945, it felt different. The air was stifling, thick not with humidity, but with dread. The officers who gathered inside did not sit with the usual sharp, disciplined posture. Instead, they stood clustered in uneasy knots, whispering behind rigid expressions. The reconnaissance pilot's report had spread through the headquarters with unsettling speed. He had not merely described devastation, he had described obliteration. The kind that defied physics, strategy, and military logic. And though no one had spoken the words aloud yet, every man in the room sensed that the world they understood had shifted without warning. At the center table, the senior intelligence officer, Colonel Nishina, laid out the pilot's sketches, rough drawings of a flattened cityscape, circular blast patterns, and notes about heat beyond measurement. He paused before addressing the room, knowing that every sentence he spoke would deepen the fear already coiling in the atmosphere. This destruction, he began, his voice low but steady, does not resemble anything caused by conventional weapons. It is not incendiary bombing. It is not a cluster of high explosive strikes. It is not a chemical attack. It is something else. The officers exchanged glances. Some looked skeptical, others terrified. General Anami, the war minister, leaned forward, his broad hands tightening into fists. He had built his career on battlefield realism, on the grit and blood of traditional warfare. To him, talk of impossible weapons sounded like dangerous speculation. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked. Nishina hesitated a moment, as though crossing a fragile threshold. "I am implying," he said carefully, "that the Americans may have succeeded in developing an entirely new type of explosive, something with unprecedented destructive capability." A murmur spread through the room, tense and disbelieving. General Kawabe, one of the more scientifically informed men in the high command, stepped forward. "Are you speaking of the rumors?" he asked quietly. The room fell silent again. The rumors. Everyone knew them, though few dared discuss them. Intelligence circles had whispered about them for years, a secret American project, immense in scale, involving physicists who had disappeared from universities, factories producing unfamiliar materials, research sites buried deep in the desert. Most dismissed these whispers as exaggerations. America had resources, yes, but not magic. Yet the destruction of Hiroshima looked like magic dark, unnatural magic, born of science, pushed beyond moral limits. Colonel Nishina nodded slowly. "Yes, the rumors." Anami scowled. "You refer to the so-called super weapon, the device powered by splitting atoms?" His tone carried disbelief, but also a hint of fear he could not conceal. "Yes, General." Another officer spoke up, voice cracking slightly. But such a weapon. It would require energies beyond comprehension. Entire factories of uranium. Calculations that push physics to its limits. It would take years, decades, perhaps. How could the Americans— They can, Kawabe interrupted sharply. And if what we saw in Hiroshima is accurate, they have. The room seemed to inhale collectively. Nishina tapped the sketch again. Look at the radius. Look at the symmetry. The epicenter has no crater because everything, not just buildings, but soil, stone, metal, was vaporized before collapse. This was not a conventional explosion. No TNT, no gasoline, no incendiary mixture can produce such uniform annihilation. He flipped to another sheet, a rough depiction of the burned silhouettes reported by the pilot. These impressions, these shadows burned into the ground, suggest a flash of unimaginable intensity, a burst of light and heat stronger than the sun. At that, a few officers looked away, unable to meet the evidence on the table. General Anami rose from his seat. So you are telling us, he said slowly, that the Americans have created a weapon capable of destroying an entire city with one strike? The question hung like smoke in the air. Nishina lowered his head. Yes, General. That is my conclusion. A cold shiver rippled through the room. For years, Japan had fought against overwhelming odds, its navy crippled, its air force dwindling, its cities burned by nightly raids. Yet the High Command had clung to one last certainty, that war obeyed identifiable rules, measurable forces, predictable limits. They had lost battles, ships, territory, yet they understood how they were losing. This gave them strategy, dignity, and determination. But now the rules had changed. Kawabe cleared his throat. We have known for decades that the theory was possible. Nuclear fission, chain reactions, the energy locked inside matter itself. He paused, weighing his next words carefully. But no nation, not even ours at the height of our scientific capacity, could weaponize such a thing quickly. And yet, Nishina murmured, the Americans appear to have done it. The realization was sinking into every corner of the room. Officers who had once spoken with unyielding confidence now stared at the table, their faces pale. One of the younger strategists, Major Fujita, finally broke the silence. If they have one such bomb, could they have more? No one answered immediately. The implications were too vast, too horrifying. But Kawabe eventually nodded. If they succeeded once, they can succeed again. Their industrial capacity is enormous. If they have mastered the production, they may have a stockpile. Fujita's voice tightened. Could Tokyo be next? A chill swept through the room. General Anami slammed his hand on the table. We cannot assume that. We cannot surrender our morale to speculation. But his words sounded hollow, even to himself. Nishina continued, softer now. The enemy may now possess a weapon that renders our defensive strategies obsolete. Fortifications, bunkers, even dispersal tactics. They mean nothing against a bomb that destroys an entire city in a single blast. The officers fell into a heavy silence, each man trapped in his own spiraling thoughts. Pride battled with reason. Honor battled with fear. For years, Japan had relied on resilience, on the will to endure hardship, on the belief that sacrifice could outlast American might. But how do you outlast the power to erase cities? General Kawabe spoke again, his voice grave. If this truly is an atomic bomb, then warfare has entered a new age, and Japan is unprepared. The word unprepared hung heavily. It had never been applied to the Imperial High Command before, not even in the darkest moments of the war. Anami exhaled slowly. We must confirm this weapon's nature. We must determine whether the Americans can strike again, and we must consider— His jaw tightened. We must consider the possibility that continuing this war may lead to the annihilation of the nation itself. No one objected. The first whisper had already grown into a chilling certainty. What destroyed Hiroshima was not merely a new bomb. It was a new reality. And Japan had only begun to understand its terrifying implications. The hours following the revelation of Hiroshima's destruction unfolded with the slow, suffocating weight of a nightmare. Soldiers moved through the corridors of the imperial headquarters with forced discipline, but their stiff movements betrayed their anxiety. Rumors spread faster than official reports. Some whispered that Hiroshima had been swallowed by a natural disaster. Others insisted it had been struck by a secret American weapon, while a few clung to the false hope that the reconnaissance pilot had simply misinterpreted what he saw. Anything seemed easier to believe than the truth. In the main war room, the High Command gathered once more. Maps of the Pacific, once vibrant with strategic plans and markers, now hung limp on the walls, silent reminders of a directionless war. The atmosphere was thick with conflicting emotions, disbelief, anger, confusion, and a growing unspoken fear. General Anami stood at the head of the table, his posture rigid but his eyes betraying exhaustion. "We must remain rational," he declared, though his voice carried more strain than authority. "We cannot accept wild conclusions. Until we understand what happened, we must not draw assumptions that could demoralize the nation." Across from him, Lieutenant General Kawabe studied the table with a grim, hollow stare. "It is not an assumption," he murmured. "It is a deduction based on the evidence. Hiroshima was destroyed by a single explosion, a single device. That is not speculation. It is fact." Anami scowled, but Kawabe's calmness unsettled him. "We have seen massive destruction before," Anami countered. "The Americans firebombed Tokyo, leaving it in ruin. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, all burned in a night. Are we to forget that conventional weapons can cause devastation?" Kawabe shook his head. "Those cities burned, yes, but they were still cities. Streets remained, structures remained. Survivors crawled out from the ruins. Hiroshima—" He hesitated, as if saying the next words would cement their truth in stone. "Hiroshima no longer exists." The room darkened with silence. A colonel from the Air Staff Council spoke next, his voice strained by disbelief. "If this was truly an atomic explosion, could it not be a single anomaly? Perhaps the Americans have only one such weapon, a prototype, a desperate gamble to force surrender." This idea, fragile and hopeful, captured immediate attention. Heads lifted, eyes brightened. It was the first thought anyone had voiced that carried even a faint trace of hope. "Yes," another officer said quickly, "a single device would require enormous resources. It is logical to assume they could build only one." "Or perhaps two," the colonel added reluctantly. "But certainly not more." For a moment, the room breathed again. The possibility of singularity offered a sliver of stability. If America possessed only one bomb, Japan could still negotiate, could still fight, could still endure. But Kawabe shattered the illusion with a quiet shake of his head. "You are forgetting the scale of the United States, their factories, their manpower, their scientific institutions. If they can build one, they can build many. Perhaps they already have." A ripple of horror passed through the officers. General Anami slammed his hand on the table. "We cannot descend into panic. Our duty is to maintain control. We must verify, analyze, and respond with discipline. This is not the time for fear." "But fear is precisely what this weapon is designed to create," Kawabe replied. "And it is succeeding." The argument exposed a deeper fracture, one that had been widening quietly for months. Japan's leadership was no longer unified. The war had drained not only resources, but also conviction. The military still insisted on resistance, clinging to the belief that unconditional surrender would destroy the nation's soul. The Navy, nearly annihilated, no longer had the strength to support such optimism. The civilian government teetered between desperation and despair, and the Emperor remained distant, watching events unfold with increasing sorrow. And now a new force, a weapon that rewrote the balance of war, threatened to push the leadership past the breaking point. A young intelligence officer named Takeda stepped forward, clutching a set of reports. His face was pale, his voice trembling. "Generals, we have additional information." He placed the documents on the table with an unsteady hand. Intercepted American broadcasts show no celebration of a major air raid, no mention of bombers returning, nothing to suggest multiple aircraft participated in the attack. Anami frowned. Meaning what? Takeda swallowed. Meaning the bomb was delivered by a single aircraft. The officers stared at him. The magnitude of that statement was overwhelming. A single plane delivering a blow equal to or more powerful than an entire fleet. "This defies reason," an admiral muttered, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. "If our radar had detected one bomber, we would not have sounded an alarm. It would have been dismissed as a reconnaissance flight." "Exactly," Kawabe said. "The Americans exploited our assumptions. They used our own logic against us." Takeda continued, unable to hide his dread. "We also believe the explosion generated light visible for miles, and the temperature at the center exceeded anything recorded in human history." The phrase "exceeded anything in human history" echoed through the room. General Anami rubbed his temple as though fighting a growing headache. "We are soldiers. We must speak of strategy, options, countermeasures." His voice faltered slightly. "What defenses do we have?" The officers exchanged looks. No one wanted to be the one to say it. Finally, Kawabe answered. "There are none." The words rang like a death sentence. "The only defense," he added, "is to prevent the Americans from using another one." "How?" Anami snapped. "Through sheer will? Through spirit alone? We have no shields against the sun." The argument dissolved into heated voices. Some demanded retaliation, though they had nothing to retaliate with. Others insisted Japan must negotiate immediately. A few clung to denial, insisting that the Americans were bluffing, that Hiroshima had suffered a freak accident or an experimental device never to be repeated. But beneath the shouting, one truth grew stronger. Japan's war machine was collapsing. Its ships lay rusting at the bottom of the sea. Its planes were scattered wrecks across airfields. Its factories were silent or smoldering from previous raids. Its soldiers were exhausted shadows of the warriors they once were. And now America had revealed a weapon powerful enough to finish what firebombing had begun. The shouting finally died down. The generals stood in grim silence, the weight of reality crushing them all. For the first time in the entire war, Japan's high command felt truly powerless. They had lost cities before, but never like this. They had faced overwhelming odds before, but never an enemy with the power to annihilate a nation with the press of a button. Shock and denial still lingered, but something else had begun to take shape, creeping quietly into the room like a shadow. The realization that their world, their strategy, their pride, their war was coming to an end, and nothing they had left could stop it. Dusk settled over Tokyo like a shroud. The red sun hovered low on the horizon, dimmed by the haze of distant fires and the lingering smoke of a nation exhausted by war. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters, the lights burned late, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Men who once spoke with unwavering authority now moved with hesitation, each step burdened by the knowledge that the world had changed in a single blinding flash. The High Command had reconvened once more, This time, not to debate tactics or strategy, but to confront a truth they had spent hours trying to avoid. No one said it aloud, yet every man who entered the war room sensed it. The destruction of Hiroshima was not merely a disaster, it was a sign, a warning, perhaps even the prelude to national extinction. General Anami stood near the center of the room, facing the map of Japan pinned to the wall. His broad shoulders rose and fell in heavy breaths. He had always believed in the spirit of resistance. He believed that a nation's will could defy even impossible odds. But as he studied the map, he saw cities not as proud symbols, but as fragile targets. Tokyo, Kyoto, Fukuoka, Sapporo, each one a heartbeat of the nation, each one vulnerable. Behind him, the door closed softly. Lieutenant General Kawabe entered, carrying a folder that looked far too thin to contain anything hopeful. He approached quietly, his expression carved with fatigue. They confirmed the measurements, Kawabe said. Anami did not turn. The blast radius, even larger than we thought. Anami clenched his jaw. He didn't ask for the exact numbers. He no longer needed them. The facts were clear enough. And the casualties? Kawabe hesitated. Impossible to calculate precisely, but tens of thousands, likely more. His voice dropped. Perhaps many more. A silence settled between them, a silence that was no longer just fear, but mourning. Mourning for Hiroshima and for what the future might bring. Gradually, the rest of the high command filtered into the room. Some looked shaken. Others masked their dread behind hardened expressions. But no one walked with the confidence they had once carried like armor. Colonel Nishina, the physicist-turned-intelligence officer, stood before the table and placed a binder on it. The sound echoed too loudly. "I have prepared an analysis," he said quietly. "Based on the reconnaissance report, intercepted communications, and scientific calculations." "Speak," Anami ordered. Nishina opened the binder, though it was clear he already knew every word inside. The weapon dropped on Hiroshima was not a variation of existing explosives. It was not an enlarged bomb. It was something fundamentally different. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "We believe it was a fission-based device." No one moved. No one breathed. It generated a heat comparable to the surface of the sun, light beyond the threshold of human tolerance. Pressure waves stronger than any recorded explosion. He turned a page, hands trembling. "This weapon does not just destroy buildings. It erases them. It does not just kill. It annihilates." A low murmur spread through the room. Anger, horror, disbelief. General Umezu, the chief of the general staff, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "How certain are you?" Nishina met his gaze. "Certain enough to say this. Hiroshima was not a fluke. It was not a prototype. It was a demonstration." The word demonstration hit like a strike to the gut. A demonstration implied intention, a message, a calculated show of power. Anami shook his head slowly, struggling against a truth he did not want to accept. "If the Americans wished to demonstrate their power," he muttered, "why not choose a purely military target? Hiroshima was a city." Hiroshima was a military hub, Kawabe reminded him. But that was not the true purpose. They chose Hiroshima because its destruction would be unmistakable, unignorable. Umezu exhaled sharply. "Then we must assume they have more." "Yes," Nishina whispered. "We must assume that." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. For months, the High Command had clung to the belief that they could still influence the outcome of the war, if not to win, then to negotiate favorable terms. But now, negotiation seemed less like a strategy and more like a necessity for survival. General Toyoda, one of the last remaining pillars of resistance within the Navy, crossed his arms. "We have endured the firebombing of our cities," he said. We have endured naval defeat, air superiority, starvation, disease. Yet we did not surrender. Why must this change anything? Nishina turned toward him. The look he gave was not disrespectful, but deeply pained. Because this weapon removes the possibility of endurance, he took a step forward. If they can destroy Hiroshima with one bomb, they can destroy Tokyo with another, and then Osaka, and then Nagoya. They do not need fleets. They do not need invasions. They can end Japan city by city, each strike delivered by a single aircraft we cannot intercept. Toyoda's face faltered for the first time. Anami rubbed his temples. His voice, once thunderous, now sounded like a man aging by the minute. We have discussed the worst. But what is the best possibility? That the Americans have only one more bomb? 2? That they will use them as leverage and no more? Nishina shook his head. Even that is catastrophic. If we do nothing, if we continue, another city will die, and then another. Perhaps even this one. The officers looked around the room instinctively, as if expecting a brilliant flash of light to burst through the windows at any moment. Kawabe spoke next, his voice quiet but steady. This weapon has changed the nature of war, and we are standing at the edge of a cliff. Anami sank slowly into his chair, the weight of command finally collapsing onto him. So, he murmured, this is what it feels like to face the impossible. Kawabe nodded. Yes, and we must choose now whether pride will guide us or reason. No one challenged him. The mood in the room shifted. The earlier arguments, bravado and denial, dissolved into something colder and more honest. Grim realization. They could no longer pretend that Japan could fight on. They could no longer rely on courage alone to defend the homeland. They could no longer gamble with the lives of millions in the hope of a miracle. The Americans had revealed a power beyond anything the world had ever seen. And for the first time, Japan's leaders understood the simple, devastating truth. The war was no longer unwinnable. It was unlosable if they refused to surrender. Anami looked around the room with hollow eyes. "Prepare the council," he said. "It is time we speak of the one thing we swore never to discuss. Surrender. Not in shame, but in the fading hope of saving what remained." Night settled over Tokyo like a heavy curtain, swallowing what little hope remained in the halls of the Imperial General Headquarters. The lamps burned with a dim yellow glow, casting flickering shadows on the tatami floors, and the walls lined with maps that now felt more like gravestones than strategic tools. Outside, the city was unnervingly quiet. People sensed that something had shifted in the war, though they did not yet know what. Inside the headquarters, however, the truth had already taken root. Japan was standing on the precipice of annihilation. General Anami sat at the head of the long table, his uniform wrinkled, his expression hollow. Hours earlier, he'd been the strongest advocate for continuing the war. Now, he found himself trapped between loyalty to the empire and the chilling realization that stubbornness might destroy it. The room was full, yet every officer present felt alone. Some clutched documents they no longer wanted to read. Others stared at the walls as if searching for a way out of an impossible situation. The atmosphere was thick, not with smoke or humidity, but with dread. A dread that grew heavier with every silent minute. At last, the doors opened, and Prime Minister Suzuki entered. He was an old man, thin, exhausted, but his presence brought a gravity that even seasoned generals respected. Behind him came Foreign Minister Togo, whose expression was a mask of barely contained urgency. Suzuki took a slow breath. "You have all seen the reports," he said. "You have heard the analysis. We stand on the edge of destruction. We must now decide the path of the nation." No one spoke, No one even shifted. The weight of that decision pressed upon them like a physical force. Togo stepped forward. Normally composed, he now looked like a man who had aged decades in a single day. "Gentlemen," he began, "I must speak clearly. If we do not act, if we do not seek peace, Japan will cease to exist." General Toyota bristled. "Peace," he repeated, as if the word itself were poison. "Peace with the enemy who seeks to destroy us, who rains fire upon our cities." "Exactly, Admiral," Togo replied. "They have already shown they can destroy a city in one strike. This is not firebombing. This is annihilation." A tense silence followed. The officers all knew he was right, but acknowledging it felt like betrayal. General Umezu, grim and unyielding, shook his head. "We still have soldiers ready to defend the homeland. We still have civilians willing to sacrifice everything. If we surrender now, all their suffering will have been meaningless." Togo's eyes softened with sorrow. "If we do not surrender," he said, "there may be no nation left for them to defend." General Kawabe spoke next, his voice quiet and steady. "We face more than defeat. We face extinction. Our armies cannot stop a weapon that destroys entire cities. Our air defenses cannot intercept the planes that carry it. Our industries cannot rebuild fast enough, even if we survive another strike. Gentlemen, Hiroshima was not just a tragedy. It was a demonstration of our future, if we choose to continue." His words struck deeper than any explosion. Several officers looked down. Others closed their eyes. Some clenched their fists so tightly their knuckles whitened. But none refuted him. Anami leaned forward, pressing his palms to the table. "We swore an oath to the Emperor to defend Japan at any cost." "And what is the cost now?" Togo asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "Tell me, Anami, how many more cities? How many more children? How many more mothers and fathers? What is the price of honor when honor leads only to ashes?" Anami opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no answer. A deep silence fell once more, one heavy with shame, fear, and truth. Prime Minister Suzuki turned to Nishina, the intelligence officer. "Colonel, tell us plainly, can we prevent another atomic attack?" Nishina shook his head. "No, Prime Minister, we cannot predict it, cannot intercept it, cannot survive it." He hesitated. "If they drop another, it will be worse. The psychological impact alone. Our people will lose all hope." Suzuki closed his eyes. "Then we have no choice." But before he could continue, the door opened again quietly, reverently. A chamberlain entered and bowed deeply. "The Emperor requests to hear your deliberations," he announced. The room stiffened. Even the most resolute officers felt a chill. The Emperor rarely intervened directly. His presence signaled the gravity of the moment. A few minutes later, Emperor Hirohito walked in with gentle steps. His face, though calm, was lined with sorrow. The officers stood and bowed deeply. When he signaled them to sit, they did so, with a reverence born of both fear and devotion. "I have been informed of the tragedy in Hiroshima," the Emperor said softly, "and of the weapon capable of such destruction." His quiet voice filled the room more powerfully than any officer's command. "I have also been told," he continued, "that continuing the war may lead to the loss of the entire Japanese nation." The generals exchanged uncertain glances. They had sworn to fight to the end. But the Emperor's gaze held them steady. "The survival of my people," Hirohito said, "must come before the preservation of pride." Anami's breath caught. It was the sentence he had fought against for years, and the sentence he now knew he needed to hear. "If we continue the war," the Emperor said, "our nation may be reduced to little more than a memory. We must consider a path that preserves what remains, so that future generations may rebuild." Togo bowed his head deeply. "Your Majesty speaks with wisdom. The officers, one by one, silently felt the last foundation of denial crumble. General Umezu's resistance weakened. "If it is your Majesty's wish," he said quietly, "then we must consider surrender." General Toyota, shaking slightly, lowered his eyes. "The Navy can no longer defend the home islands. We acknowledge this." Even Anami bowed his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "If it is to save the nation, then I will honor your Majesty's will." Hirohito nodded with solemn grace. "Then let us seek a way to end the war. Let us prevent further suffering. Let us preserve Japan's future." A final silence filled the room, this time not of fear, but of acceptance. The decision was not yet official. It would take days to negotiate terms, days to convince those who still clung to hope or delusion. But the direction was clear, irreversible. Hiroshima had shattered more than a city. It had shattered the illusion that Japan could continue the wars. And now, at last, the High Command began walking slowly, painfully, toward the only path left, a path they had once sworn never to take: surrender. Not as defeat, but as the final act to save a nation standing on the brink of oblivion.